It was a crisp morning at one of the busiest airports in the country. Travelers were bustling around, dragging their luggage behind them, their faces tired, but eager to reach their destinations. The hum of voices filled the air as flight attendants made their rounds, and the scent of coffee mixed with the scent of freshly cleaned floors. It was a typical airport scene until something extraordinary was about to unfold. At the gate for a first-class flight to New York, passengers anxiously waited for boarding to begin. Among them stood a tall young man, casually dressed in jeans and a hoodie, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He stood a little apart from the rest of the crowd, his demeanor calm and unassuming, blending into the crowd. There was something about him, though, that seemed oddly familiar. His quiet confidence, the way he carried himself, set him apart, even in this busy place. And then the announcement came: priority boarding for first-class passengers. Without hesitation, the young man stepped forward, handing his ticket to the gate attendant. Her eyes flickered briefly at the name on the ticket before she smiled politely, taking the ticket and scanning it. "Mr. Barron Trump, welcome aboard," she said, her voice neutral but respectful. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers began almost immediately, whispers spreading like wildfire. Barron Trump. The name alone carried weight, drawing attention even when he tried to go unnoticed. He wasn't the type to flaunt his status, and he certainly didn't seem interested in the public's gaze. He walked through the gate, down the jet bridge, and into the aircraft, his face calm but determined. The cabin was elegant, first class of course, but Barron didn't seem at all concerned with luxury. He had a quiet purpose, a sense of calm resolve that most passengers couldn't quite place. As Barron made his way down the aisle of the plane, passengers in first class were already settling into their plush seats, some flipping through magazines, others chatting quietly among themselves. But as Barron passed by, the chatter faded, and all eyes turned toward him. The moment was brief, but it was enough for those around him to realize exactly who was on board. He reached his seat, an aisle seat near the window. He settled in without fuss, his posture relaxed but dignified. He didn't seem bothered by the stares or the curiosity swirling around him. He simply opened his book and began to read, the noise of the world outside fading into the background. But little did he know, something was about to change the course of this flight. It started with a slight disruption near the entrance to the plane. A man in his late 60s, with a military cap perched atop his head, stood near the doorway. He was an older gentleman, his eyes weary but proud. His clothes were simple, worn, and clearly showing the signs of a life well lived, one of sacrifice and service. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, but it was clear he wasn't in the same place as the first-class passengers around him. He was out of his element. The flight attendant stood beside him, her voice apologetic. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her tone trying to mask the frustration, "but it seems there's been an issue with your seat assignment. We don't have an available spot in first class, and the economy seats are full. We'll have to move you to a later flight." The veteran glanced at her, his face momentarily sinking. "It's okay," he replied with a sigh. "I'll wait. I can handle it." His voice was steady, but the weariness of his life echoed in those simple words. Barron's eyes had followed the exchange from his seat. He'd been observing quietly, but the moment he saw the veteran's disappointed face, something stirred within him. His brow furrowed slightly, his gaze never leaving the man. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right with him. This veteran, who had given so much for his country, was being overlooked. Barron could feel the injustice in his gut, and that moment, without a second thought, he knew what he had to. He stood up abruptly, his eyes never leaving the veteran. The flight attendant didn't notice at first, too caught up in trying to figure out what to do. But Barron moved swiftly, purposefully, toward the man, and gently tapped him on the shoulder. The veteran looked up, surprised, unsure of what to expect. "Excuse me," Barron said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to give him my seat." The flight attendant turned around, her eyes wide. "Sir, are you sure?" she asked. "This is a first-class seat." Barron nodded, his expression serious. "I'm sure. Please, let him have it." His voice was steady, unwavering. The veteran looked at him, taken aback. "Son, "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, but also with confusion. "I'm fine, really." But Barron's smile was kind, unwavering. "I insist," he said. "You've done so much more than I ever will. You deserve this." The passengers around them were now watching, some whispering softly to each other, others openly staring in awe at Barron's gesture. The flight attendants, equally taken aback, didn't know how to respond. They had never seen anything like this on a flight before. The veteran, overwhelmed, nodded slowly. "Well, thank you, young man. You don't know what this means to me." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of the moment too much to hold back. And with that, the veteran took Barron's seat, settling into the plush, comfortable chair. Barron, on the other hand, didn't make a big show of it. He simply nodded politely, turned, and walked toward the back of the plane, where economy seats were available. But before he could sit down, something incredible happened. A man in the first-class cabin stood up abruptly. His voice was firm, but filled with admiration. "You're not going to the back," he said, his words cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Take my seat." Barron paused, startled by the sudden outpouring of kindness. But the man wasn't the only one. Another passenger stood up. "Take mine too. What you did for him, it's unbelievable." One by one, passengers began offering their first-class seats to Barron. The flight attendants were stunned, but they moved quickly to accommodate the sudden change in seating. Barron, however, didn't want to make a fuss. "Thank you, but I'm okay," he said, shaking his head. "It's not necessary." The kindness, though, didn't stop. More passengers were now on their feet, extending offers for Barron to take their seats. And yet, Barron's humility never wavered. He stood at the back of the plane, grateful but insistent that the gesture was not about him. It was about making sure the veteran was treated with the dignity he deserved. As the flight continued, the story spread throughout the plane, with passengers sharing the incredible act of kindness they had witnessed. By the time the plane touched down at their destination, Barron's act of selflessness had already gone viral. People were talking about it everywhere. In the world of social media, the story quickly gained traction. A young man who could have stayed in luxury, yet chose to share that with someone who had given so much for this country. When Barron stepped off the plane, he was met with applause, not from the passengers, but from those who had witnessed the entire exchange. A few took out their phones to capture the moment, but Barron, ever the private individual, simply smiled and nodded, accepting the applause quietly. The veteran, now at the gate, was waiting for him, his eyes filled with tears, and his voice quivered when he shook Barron's hand. "Thank you," he said, his words full of emotion. "Thank you for reminding me that not all hope is lost, that kindness is still alive in this world." Barron nodded, his response simple but profound. "Thank you for your service. You deserve so much more." As they parted ways, Barron's story would live on, not just as a moment of generosity, but as a reminder to everyone who heard it. True kindness is not about grand gestures, but about understanding, humility, and knowing when to lift someone else up.